Last week I was talking about how during different periods in time there are different sins which we sort of put on a pillar and on a pedestal and we treat those as more severe. And there are certain sins that people identify as, this is the end of the world, or this is the downfall of our nature and this nation or whatever, or this downfall of these people or whatever. And so we have certain sins which are categorically greater than other sins. But back in the early history of the Christian church, for some reason, I'm not exactly sure the historical reason as to why this happened, but some leaders in the church came up with a list of 7 sins. And these were called the 7 deadly sins. Anybody here think they know what the 7 deadly sins are? All right, go ahead, tell us.
Lust, envy, sloth, pride, greed, wrath, and gluttony.
Good job. And interestingly, some of those, there were some people that taught that if you committed those sins, there was no forgiveness. That was it. You signed fortunately that's not biblical or correct, because there wouldn't be anybody in heaven, but that's what they believe. But there's one sin on there that really surprises me, and that's the sin of sloth, or how we would interpret laziness. And, it's not something that we put way up there, is it? It's like, there's a lot of sins that we just sort of say, well, yeah, that's just sort of part of life or whatever. And then we have these really horrible sins like murder and rape, and which aren't on the list, by the way. But sloth is on the list. Being lazy is on the list. And so this morning I want to talk to you, actually, not so much about laziness, but about work. And it was so fascinating to hear Russ talk about that, because it exactly was the sermon. In fact, I could have just had him stand and conclude the benediction. So that would have been perfect, but I'll take a little bit more time and spend some time on it. But the first thing I want to point out to you is that I'm going to use the word laziness rather than sloth, because sloth sounds more like an animal in South America. But laziness is not a personality trait. Laziness is not something that you are inherently born with. In fact, I think it's not a very helpful term. I think it's probably not helpful for you to point out to your children, for example, that they are lazy, or to call someone a lazy person, because God didn't create anyone to be lazy. Lazy is simply the result of not learning to work, or not learning to work well. And learning to work is something which you have to learn. And that actually is part of our nature. And it's part of our nature which is sort of hidden behind the laziness, which sort of comes out. But the Bible tells us very clearly in Genesis, and let me just flip to you and read to this passage. In Genesis chapter 2:15, it says, the Lord God took the man and put him in the garden to work. He put him in the garden to work and to take care of it. So part of our essence, part of our humanness is work. And that can be defined in a lot of different ways. I mean, it could be using physical work, could be using your mind. There are a lot of ways that we work. But the truth of the matter is that we were created to be people that work. And it's something that we resist. And so I want to talk to you this morning about it. And the first thing that's important to remember is that it is not a personality trait. It's not a factor of who you are. You can't look at anyone and say they are a lazy person. They may be exhibiting lazy behavior. But at their core, none of us are lazy. We were created to be people that are industrious and to work. And there are so many great passages about how work is something which elevates us, and how work is really a vehicle between us and God. It's a way that we connect to God. And some of your most valuable worship times with God will be while you're working. And that is so true. I find myself, my very best prayer times with God are when I'm doing some menial task. Just something that's redundant and repetitive, and it has to get done, and so I do it. And while I'm doing it, God and I are just having this great conversation because we were created to be people that work. So I want to specifically, let me just share a couple of verses to you that are sort of interesting. In Leviticus, he's talking about the Sabbath. And he says, for 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath, complete rest, a holy convocation. You shall not do any work. It's a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwellings. So it's inferred in this passage that work will be a part of our life. In fact, most of us work 5 days. They worked 6 days, and they had 1 day in which they did not work. In fact, they were prohibited from working. So work is important, but it's also important to understand that you need to also be a person that is able to enjoy rest. So for some of you, you don't need to hear a message on work, you need to hear a message on rest. But I preached that message. Whether you heard it or not, I don't know. But, rest is really important to us, and it needs to happen on a regular place, and you need not feel guilty for resting. Some people are so consumed with work that they feel guilty if they sit down and aren't working. There are other people that feel guilty if they're working. But anyway, so in that command, it's just implied. This is a really interesting verse in Ecclesiastes. It says, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. So there's an encouragement there. And now I want to look at a passage in Ephesians, actually, just one verse. It's Ephesians 4:28. And the verse says that he who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with one who has needs. And you read that. In fact, the first time I read that, I thought, well, that doesn't really apply to me. I'm not a thief. I don't steal things. But I think we need to sort of redefine what stealing is. And stealing is when you take something which you don't deserve, or even if you want something that you don't deserve. And what it is actually a form of laziness. It's actually a way in which you want your provisions to be met by someone else or something else. And the Bible makes it very clear that our provisions from God are supposed to be through our own efforts. Or they may be through the efforts of somebody else. If somebody is meeting your needs and you're unable to work, that's implied in that verse as well. And so we work so that we can meet our needs and also the needs of other people. So there's a lot of ways that this form of laziness comes out. And let me point you to one which is kind of like the elephant in the room, I suppose, because we all make fun of it, but that's the lottery. And I know Christians, and I don't know if any of you do, probably maybe you do, but they buy lottery tickets, and in my estimation, that is a form of equivalent to stealing, because what you're wanting to happen is for other people who are giving their money into this huge pot to take care of your needs in an excessive way so that you won't have to work. It's the epitome of laziness. It's the epitome of sloth. It is, in essence, a form of stealing. Even though you're paying money into this little pot, what your desire is, the essence of your heart is, I don't want to work. I want other people to give me all of their wealth so that I'll never have to work again. And that money comes from other people. You realize that. I mean, just because you're getting it doesn't mean somebody else didn't give it. It didn't come from you. It didn't come from some magic wand or some fairy genie something. It came from generally, and what studies have shown, it generally comes from the poor people because it's an act of desperation for them. So that just is sort of one form of it. But there are many ways this happens. There are ways in which we try to work our way around trying to legitimately provide for ourselves. We're looking for secret investments, or we're looking for special deals, or anything that we can in some way avoid simply working and having God provide what we need. So it's just something for us to be thinking about, and different laziness comes in a lot of different forms. So in order to sort of confront this idea of laziness, it's important to understand, as I said earlier, that working is something that you have to learn. And if you're a parent, one of your primary responsibilities, I believe, is to teach your children to work. And that's not always an easy task. And let me say that what I have found in my life, that positive rewards work way better than negative rewards as far as teaching people to work. Now, the military is actually a very good, effective way to teach people to work, but they use primarily negative reinforcements. And they do, ultimately, people that come out of the military, I've never met anyone that came out of the military that didn't know how to work. But I think you can accomplish the same goals with positive things. In fact, you can train yourself to be a good worker. And some of the methods that you can use are actually may sound a little silly. I knew some individuals that taught themselves to work in specific areas by putting stickers on calendars. And it seems silly, but there's something about working toward even a silly reward like that, or moving toward a silly reward like that, that actually does accomplish what you want. The other thing I think is important is to take little steps, not to try and see the whole thing. Don't try to fix every single problem of laziness in your life. You know, if your entire house is a disaster, just work on one desk or something. That your goal is to keep this desk clean for a week. And so do it in increments, work on it gradually. One of the things that I did with all of my children was to turn work into games. And we had wonderful times cutting down thistles to get to the castle where the fairy princess was, and collecting tansy to make bouquets for the queen. And you know, it's very similar, I think, to learning to like food. Because, you know, all children are born with a distaste for anything except sugar. Have you noticed that? All children hate all kinds of food except sweets. And so they have to learn from a very early age that they can enjoy anything. And you can teach yourself to like virtually any flavor on the planet. I know that there are some flavors that you think that you could never learn to like, but you can, because it's simply impulses from your tongue going to your brain, and you can rewire that. You can turn it in a different way. There are some tastes that I choose not to rewire. I'm going to leave them right where they are. I'm happy with that. Forrest can have all the kidney pie he wants. I'm just happy not enjoying that particular flavor. But the truth is that you can. I could. I remember when I first got to Ecuador, first time in my life I'd ever eaten papaya, and they put the plate down, and I remember Linda looking at me, and she's saying, "You're not going to like this." No one likes papaya. For some reason, no one tastes papaya and likes it the first time. But I just encourage you to take a little bit and just keep trying it for a few days. And she said, very quickly, you'll come to like it. And that was exactly what happened. The first time I tasted it, I thought, this is horrible. This is the worst, because it's so contrary to any flavor I ever had. My mind immediately said, this is horrible. Now papaya is one of my favorite fruits on the planet. But she helped me to understand that was a process of learning to like something. And we did the same thing with flavors with our children. We would often give them something new. We say, okay, now when you first taste this, your mind's going to say, I don't know what this is. This is different. And we encourage them to use the word different rather than I don't like it. This is different. I'm not used to this. And so we would say, okay, just take a little bit and we'll try it again, and we keep encouraging them and help them to rechange and to refocus their mind. And the same thing can be true of work. That you can actually learn to enjoy virtually any kinds of work. But we live in a society that sort of abhors work. And there's these phrases like, thank God it's Friday. You know, like all we live for is the weekends. What a horrible existence. We should thank God it's Monday. And I don't know what your jobs are all like. Some of them you hate going to work. You should change that attitude. And you can. You can learn to want to go to work on Monday morning. I know you think that could never happen. It can. Because you can learn to like any form of work. And I have done so many different kinds of jobs in my life. When I was in high school, I was basically in charge of a cattle operation. We had 40 head of cattle, and I was basically the sole person running the whole operation. And the owner worked full-time at Boeing, and I, on weekends and all summer long, took care of this operation. And one of the jobs that we had to do every spring was clean out the barns. And they didn't get cleaned all winter long. And so by the time spring came, it was like this deep. And we had to wear big boots. And by the time I went home that night, I had unusual auras around me. But you know, I could do that. And we would laugh, and I had a buddy I worked with, and we just enjoyed the work of ripping that stuff out and getting it out of there. You can learn to enjoy any kind of work. Whatever your job is, your plan should be not to get out of work, but to learn to enjoy what God puts before you. And if God doesn't want you where you are, have him move you. Put you somewhere else. And the very reason he may not be moving you out of where you are is because he wants you to love what you're doing. I had a friend once back in college, and we were working as custodians together, and you know, what custodians do, and I enjoyed being a custodian. But I remember him saying to me one time, saying, you know what, my aspiration in life is to be a security guard, where you sit on a stool all day long and do absolutely nothing. That was his life's goal. Because he hated anything that required exertion of any kind. I don't know if he's even still alive. Probably not. But that was his aspiration, was to just sit and not even have to think, just in this numb, comatose state. And what a sad existence. We weren't created to be like that. We were created to do, to be, to work, to accomplish tasks. The other aspect about us that I want to challenge is the aspect of retirement. I have no problem with people refocusing their lives. But if you imagine retirement as an escape from work, then that's a disaster. If that's your goal, you'll probably end up dead not long after you retire. What you need to say is, well, I'm getting weary of this particular form of work, and I'd like to try to do something else. And it may not involve a paycheck. Maybe it will involve working with refugees, or maybe it will involve working in your garden. Maybe God will give you this amazing thing to create to his glory, and you'll invite people to come in and see what you're doing. I don't know. But move away from the idea of retirement as being a place of simply relaxation. No, it should be part of retirement. In fact, relaxation should be a part of work. It just shouldn't change. There should always be this rhythm of work and of relaxation, and of work and relaxation, and taking time away and then going back and working on something again. When I go away in the summer by myself, one of the things that I really enjoy doing is to find something to do while I'm out there. I remember one year I was way up in the boonies by Mount Rainier, and I found this huge culvert that was completely buried in the sand. It was like a piece of plastic that's been around like 10 feet long. And I just decided I was going to dig that out while I was there. And every day I would get out there, and I didn't even have any very good tools, but I was just digging and working, and it just felt so good just to work. And I eventually got that whole culvert out, and I don't even remember what I did with it. But just the point of having something physical to do, and to feel, like Russ said, feeling the next day, feeling your muscles feel like. I remember recently saying to somebody, Sometimes it's so frustrating that it takes so long to build muscles and so quick for them to go away. Isn't that true? That's kind of frustrating. But I think now that the reason for that is that because God wants to remind us that we need to be people of activity. We don't move to some place and then we're stagnant there. We need to be people that are doing. And it is so essential as to the essence of who we are. And our work is really a reflection of our relationship to God. There's one last verse I want to share with you. And it's important because it puts the proper perspective on all this. Because if you just heard this talk, you could just simply say, that sounds like a good psychological talk. You could hear that at the Rotary Club or whatever. But there's another aspect of this that's so important, so crucial. In Haggai, God says this, I smote you and every work of your hand with blasting wind, mildew, and hail, yet you did not come back to me. So work can be extremely frustrating, extremely irritating if God is not the focus of it. Because it will just end in decay, will just end in frustration, and you will simply become frustrated with what you're doing rather than feel like God is being glorified in it. So the most important ingredient in this whole sermon is that your work has to be a reflection of your relationship to God, whatever you're doing. This was a lesson I learned early on in construction. I was building a wall. I got the wall up, and it was wrong. It was out of whack. And I spent literally hours trying to fix that wall to get it to be straight. And finally, I just tore the whole thing down and started all over. And what God said to me at that point was, you need to make sure that you take the time to do it right every time. And if you don't, then simply go back and do it right. Don't try to repair what you've done. And so I recognized and realized that I wasn't just building this wall for a customer, that I was building this as a reflection of my relationship to God. And that crooked wall was a statement of my crooked aspect of my work, and that it wasn't a reflection of my relationship to God. That's a crucial part. We're going to transition to communion, and I'm going to say something about work in relationship to communion, but sort of to bring us to that place, I want to sing a hymn together. And as we sing this hymn, I kind of want you to mull some of the things that I've been talking about.